Please don't hurt me. I'm lost, the girl cried. The biker's response. Melted hearts. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty highway that stretched between endless fields of wheat. Mason Carter leaned into a gentle curve, the rumble of his motorcycle vibrating through his body. The blackened chrome machine growled beneath him, powerful but controlled in his experienced hands. The wind rushed past his helmet as he rode alone on the quiet road outside of Willow Creek. Most days, the solitude would have been exactly what he wanted. The Iron Lantern Motorcycle Club respected his need for these solo rides. They understood without him having to explain. Today was different. Today was for Emily. Mason had spent the morning at the small cemetery on the hill, sitting beside his little sister's grave. 10 years had passed, but the weight on his chest hadn't gotten any lighter. He'd brought fresh flowers, daisies, her favorite, and cleared away the weeds that had sprouted since his last visit. "Should have watched you closer, Em," he'd whispered, running his rough fingertips over the carved letters of her name. The memory played through his mind for the 1,000th time. Emily wandering off while he was supposed to be watching her, the frantic search, the sheriff's car pulling up with its lights flashing. Then the news that changed everything. Mason blinked hard behind his visor, focusing on the road ahead. Farmland stretched out on either side of him, peaceful and golden in the late afternoon light. Fields of wheat swayed gently in the breeze, and in the distance, cows grazed lazily on patches of green grass. It was the kind of perfect day that made the world seem right, even when it wasn't. He downshifted as he approached a gentle hill, the motorcycle responding instantly to his touch. For a few moments, Mason let himself just feel the machine beneath him, the perfect balance of power and precision. When he was riding, the constant noise in his head quieted down. The guilt eased, if only for a little while. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals rising from the sun-warmed asphalt. Mason watched it soar effortlessly, free in a way he hadn't felt in years. The road stretched empty before him, a ribbon of black cutting through the golden landscape. He'd taken the long way back from the cemetery, avoiding the main roads into Willow Creek. Mason knew what people saw when he rode through town. The leather vest with the iron lantern patch, the beard, the tattoos peeking out from under his sleeves. They saw danger, a troublemaker, someone to cross the street to avoid. What they didn't see was the man who volunteered at the animal shelter every Thursday. The guy who fixed Mrs. Henderson's porch steps last winter when they rotted through. The person who still woke up in a cold sweat, hearing his little sister calling his name. The road dipped into a small valley, and Mason let gravity pull the motorcycle forward, enjoying the sensation of floating downhill. The engine's rumble echoed off the walls of the shallow valley, the only sound besides the wind and the occasional call of birds. As he rounded the next bend, something caught his eye, a splash of color against the dull brown of the gravel shoulder. Mason eased off the throttle, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. It was small, hunched over, a bright blue t-shirt. Mason slowed the motorcycle further, the powerful machine now barely crawling forward. His heart began to beat faster as the shape came into focus. A child. A little girl. She sat huddled on the gravel, knees pulled up to her chest, head down. Even from a distance, Mason could see her small shoulders shaking. She was crying. Mason eased the motorcycle to a complete stop about 20 feet away, not wanting to frighten her with the noise or his sudden appearance. He kickstanded the bike and removed his helmet, his eyes never leaving the small figure on the roadside. The little girl didn't look up. She just kept crying, alone on the empty country road, with nothing but fields stretching out in every direction. Mason's heart thumped hard in his chest as he slipped off his bike. Something deep inside him, a protective instinct he'd carried since losing Emily, flared to life. A kid, all alone out here where the nearest house was miles away? It wasn't right. He left his helmet hanging on the handlebar and ran a hand through his flattened hair. The little girl still hadn't noticed him. Her face remained buried against her knees, her small body shaking with sobs. Mason took a deep breath. His appearance didn't exactly scream trustworthy to most folks, let alone to a scared child. The leather vest with the iron lantern patch, the thick beard, the tattoos, they made people cross the street when they saw him coming. He'd gotten used to it, but right now he wished he looked more like a friendly school teacher. "Hey there," he called softly, keeping his distance. "You okay?" The girl's head snapped up, eyes wide with fear. Mason froze in place, not wanting to scare her more. Now that she'd looked up, Mason could see she was young, maybe 5 years old. Her blonde hair hung in tangled curls around a small face smudged with dirt. Her bright blue t-shirt was torn at one sleeve and stained with grass and mud. Most concerning of all, her feet were bare and scratched, as if she'd been walking a long time. "I'm not going to come any closer unless you say it's okay," Mason said, keeping his voice gentle. He crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. "My name's Mason. I just want to help." The little girl stared at him, her eyes red from crying. She didn't speak, but at least she wasn't running away. That was something. "Are you out here all by yourself?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. Miles of empty road stretched in both directions. No cars, no houses in sight, just fields and more fields. She nodded slightly, her chin quivering. "That's pretty scary, huh?" Mason offered a small smile. "It's okay to be scared. Grown-ups get scared too sometimes." A car could come by any minute. He needed to get her off the road, but Mason knew better than to rush toward her. "I bet someone's looking for you," he said. "Your mom or dad must be real worried." At the mention of parents, fresh tears welled in her eyes. "You want to tell me your name?" Mason asked. "Might help me get you back home." The girl hugged her knees tighter. Her small feet were red and dirty, with a nasty scratch across one heel. Mason's heart twisted at the sight. "You know what?" he said, easing down to sit cross-legged on the gravel. "I've got some water in my saddlebag, and I think there's a granola bar too. You hungry?" The mention of food seemed to get her attention. She watched as Mason slowly stood and walked back to his motorcycle. He kept his movements deliberate and calm, retrieving a water bottle and the promised granola bar from his bag. He returned and set them on the ground between them, then backed away several steps. "Go ahead," he encouraged. "It's just regular water. The granola bar's got chocolate chips." The girl hesitated, then scooted forward just enough to grab the items. She took a small sip of water, then a larger one, obviously thirsty. "There you go," Mason said. "That's better, right?" She nodded again, this time meeting his eyes for just a moment before looking down. "I'd like to help you find your folks," Mason said, "but I need to know a little bit about you. Can you tell me your name?" He waited patiently while she finished a bite of the granola bar. "Lily," she finally whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. "Lily," Mason repeated with a warm smile. "That's a real pretty name." He shifted slightly, and the movement made Lily flinch. Mason immediately stilled. "It's okay," he said. "I'm just going to stay right here until we figure out what to do next." Lily's eyes darted from Mason to the road behind him, as if looking for escape. When he shifted his weight again, she suddenly scrambled backward in fear, dropping the water bottle. "Please don't hurt me. she whispered through fresh tears, her voice breaking. "I'm lost." The words hit Mason like a physical blow. He froze completely, his hands open at his sides. "I'm lost," she repeated, tears streaming down her dirty face. Mason's heart ached at the fear in the little girl's voice. Those words, "Please don't hurt me," they cut deeper than any knife could. He stayed perfectly still, kneeling a good 10 feet away from her. "I ain't gonna hurt you, sweetheart. I promise." His voice came out softer than usual, the gruff edges smoothed away. "I just want to help you get back to your family." The girl's eyes darted between Mason and the empty road, still wary, still frightened. Her small shoulders trembled under her thin t-shirt. The evening air was getting cooler as the sun dipped lower. Mason noticed goosebumps on her bare arms. "You look cold," he said gently. "I've got something that might help with that." Moving slowly, telegraphing each movement, Mason reached for his saddlebag. The leather creaked as he opened it, and he pulled out a navy blue hoodie. It was old and worn, but clean. He always kept it for unexpected rain or chilly nights. "See this? It's just a sweatshirt. Too big for you, but it's warm." He held it out toward her, then set it on the gravel between them when she didn't reach for it. "It's yours if you want it." The little girl eyed the hoodie, then Mason, then the hoodie again. Her teeth chattered slightly. "I'm gonna back up a bit more. Give you some space," Mason said, scooting backward until he was sitting cross-legged on the gravel shoulder. "Take your time." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, quick as a rabbit, the girl darted forward, snatched the hoodie, and retreated. Mason didn't move a muscle. He just watched as she struggled to pull the enormous garment over her head. It swallowed her completely, the sleeves hanging far past her fingertips, the hem nearly touching the ground. Despite everything, Mason felt a small smile tug at his lips. She looked like a tiny ghost swimming in blue fabric. "Better?" he asked. She nodded slightly, her face peeking out from the oversized hood. The fear in her eyes had dimmed, just a little. "My name's Mason," he said, tapping his chest. "Mason Carter. I ride with the Iron Lantern Motorcycle Club. That's what this patch on my vest means." He pointed to the emblem on his leather vest. "We're not bad people, just folks who like motorcycles." The girl stared at him, silent but listening. "I was just heading back to town," Mason continued, keeping his tone conversational, unthreatening. "Willow Creek, you know it? It's not far from here." She shook her head. "That's okay. Look, I want to help you find your family. They must be worried sick about you. But I need to know a little more. Can you tell me anything about where you live? Or your full name?" The girl chewed her bottom lip, considering. She was still cautious, but Mason could see her weighing his kindness against her fear. "I won't come any closer unless you say it's okay," he promised again. "Just want to get you back where you belong, that's all." A car appeared in the distance, approaching from the direction Mason had come. The girl tensed immediately. "It's all right," Mason said quickly. "That's just someone driving by. But you know what? We should probably move a bit further from the road. It's not safe to sit here." The approaching vehicle slowed as it neared them. An older couple peered out curiously at the strange scene, a bearded biker sitting on the roadside with a small child in an oversized hoodie. Mason raised a hand in greeting, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. The couple hesitated, then drove on. "See? Nothing to worry about," Mason said, though he understood why people might be concerned. A man who looked like him, alone with a frightened child. It didn't paint a pretty picture. The little girl pulled the hoodie tighter around herself, the fabric providing not just warmth, but a sense of security. Her breathing had steadied. The tears had stopped. "Can you tell me your name?" Mason tried again, his voice gentle. She swallowed hard, then whispered, "Lily." Mason smiled warmly. "Lily, that's a real pretty name." "I'm 5, she added suddenly, holding up her hand with all 5 fingers splayed. 5? That's a good age," Mason nodded. "You're a brave 5-year-old, Lily." Her lip quivered again. "I can't find my mommy, or our farm. I walked and walked, but everything looks the same." Mason nodded sympathetically. "That's scary, losing your way like that. Can you tell me about your farm? What's it look like?" "It has a red barn," Lily said, her voice growing slightly stronger. "And chickens. They run everywhere. Mommy has a garden and she bakes apple pies." Her small face crumpled. "I want my mommy." Mason looked up and down the empty stretch of highway. Not a single car had passed since the older couple drove by. The sun was sinking lower, painting the sky in deepening shades of orange and purple. Soon it would be dark, and the temperature would drop further. This wasn't a safe place for a child. "Lily," he said gently, "I don't think we should stay here on the roadside much longer. It's getting late, and it'll be dark soon. How about we ride into town together? There'll be people there who can help us find your mom." Lily clutched the oversized hoodie tighter around her small body. "On your motorcycle?" Her voice was tiny, uncertain, but no longer trembling with fear. Mason nodded. "It's perfectly safe, I promise. I'll go really slow, and you'll sit right in front of me where I can keep you secure." He paused, gauging her reaction. "What do you think?" Lily looked at the big black motorcycle, then back at Mason's face. Something in his gentle eyes and patient manner had started to earn her trust. "Will it be loud?" she asked. "A little," Mason admitted with a small smile. "But not too bad. And we won't go far. Just to town where there are telephones and people who can help us find your mom?" Lily considered this, her small face serious beneath the oversized hood. "Okay," she finally said. "That's real brave of you, Lily," Mason said. He stood up slowly, brushing gravel from his jeans. "Let me get things ready first." He walked to his motorcycle and adjusted the seat, making sure it was secure. Then he took his helmet and studied it, frowning slightly. It was much too big for Lily's head, but he hated the idea of her riding without protection. In the end, he decided safety came first. "Lily, I'd like you to wear my helmet. It's too big, but it's better than nothing." He approached her carefully, still keeping a respectful distance. "May I help you put it on?" Lily nodded, and Mason knelt beside her. With gentle hands, he placed the helmet on her head. As expected, it was enormous on her, nearly swallowing her whole face. "Can you see okay in there?" he asked, peering in at her. A small giggle escaped her lips, the first happy sound she'd made. "It's silly," she said, her voice echoing inside the helmet. Mason smiled. "It is a little silly looking, but it'll keep you safe." He helped her roll up the sleeves of the hoodie so her hands were free, then carefully lifted her. She was light as a feather in his arms, and the realization of how fragile she was made his protective instincts surge. "I'm going to sit you right here," he explained, placing her on the motorcycle seat. "And I'll be right behind you. My arms will be around you the whole time, holding the handlebars. Like a safety circle, okay?" Lily nodded, the oversized helmet bobbing comically. "Hold on to these." Mason guided her small hands to the center of the handlebars. "And if you get scared or want to stop, just tell me. I'll hear you." Mason climbed on behind her, his large frame creating a protective cocoon around her tiny body. He could feel her tense slightly. "You okay, Lily?" "Uh-huh," she said, though she sounded uncertain. "We'll go really slow, I promise. Like a bicycle, not a rocket ship." That earned him another small giggle. Mason started the engine, keeping the revs low to minimize the noise. The motorcycle rumbled to life beneath them. Lily gasped and gripped the handlebar tighter. "It's okay," Mason reassured her. "Just the engine saying hello." He eased the motorcycle forward, moving at little more than walking speed. The wind was gentle against them as they pulled onto the road toward Willow Creek. After a minute or two, Mason felt Lily relax slightly against his chest. She was getting used to the rhythm and motion. "You doing okay, sweetheart?" he asked. "Yes," she answered, sounding more confident now. "It's like flying, but not high." Mason smiled. "That's right, just like flying close to the ground." As they rode slowly along the country road, with fields of corn and wheat stretching out on either side, Lily began to chat. The initial fear had given way to a child's natural curiosity and talkativeness. "My house has a red barn," she said, her voice carrying back to Mason despite the wind and engine noise. "It's really big, bigger than your motorcycle." "Is that so?" Mason responded, happy to keep her talking. "Uh-huh. And we have chickens. They run everywhere. Sometimes they chase me, but Mommy says they're just being silly chickens." Mason chuckled. "Chickens can be funny that way." "And I have a tire swing," Lily continued excitedly. "Daddy hung it from the big oak tree. I can swing really high." The motorcycle hummed steadily as Mason guided it along the winding country roads. Fields stretched out on either side, bathed in the warm glow of late afternoon sunlight. He kept his speed deliberately slow, his arms creating a protective circle around Lily, who seemed to grow more comfortable by the minute. "My mommy makes the best apple pies," Lily continued, her voice carrying over the gentle rumble of the engine. "She lets me help roll the dough sometimes. My fingers get all sticky." "That sounds delicious," Mason replied, smiling despite himself. The child's innocent chatter was soothing in a way he hadn't expected. "I haven't had homemade apple pie in years. You should try my mommy's. She puts cinnamon?" Mason offered. "Yeah, cinnamon and sugar on top. It gets all crispy." Mason nodded, even though she couldn't see him from her position. "That does sound special." As they rounded another bend in the road, Mason scanned the landscape. Willow Creek was still about 15 minutes away at their current pace. He was trying to piece together Lily's description of her home to figure out which farm she might belong to. There were several in this area, spread far apart along these back roads. "Lily, can you tell me more about your farm? Maybe I know where it is." The oversized helmet bobbed as she nodded enthusiastically. "Our mailbox is blue. Daddy painted it last summer, and we have a long driveway with big trees." Mason frowned slightly, trying to remember a farm with a blue mailbox. "And the creek goes behind our house," Lily continued. "Mommy doesn't let me play there alone 'cause it gets deep, but sometimes we catch frogs." "A creek, huh?" Mason's brow furrowed as he tried to place the location. "What else can you see from your house?" "The water tower. I can see it from my bedroom window. Mommy says it looks like a giant lollipop." That detail made Mason sit up straighter. There was only one farm property with a direct view of Willow Creek's water tower. "Lily, does your house have a weather vane on top? A metal rooster that spins around?" "Uh-huh. His name is Rusty. Daddy says he tells us which way the wind blows." Mason's pulse quickened. He was now certain which farm she was describing, but something wasn't making sense. "And you said your barn is red?" he asked carefully. "Super red, like fire trucks, and it has a white door that squeaks." Mason slowed the motorcycle even further, his mind working overtime. A red barn with a white door, a view of the water tower, a creek running behind the property, a weather vane shaped like a rooster. The old Wilson place. But that couldn't be right. Lily, do you remember seeing any other houses near yours? Any neighbors? She shook her head, the oversized helmet wobbling comically. No. Mommy says our closest neighbors are far away. That's why I have to play with the chickens. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The Wilson farm had stood empty for years. The property had never been rebuilt after the disaster. Our driveway has big rocks on both sides, Lily added, oblivious to Mason's growing unease. And there's a broken tractor that Daddy says he'll fix someday. Each detail matched Mason's memory perfectly. The distinctive, boulder-lined driveway. The ancient tractor that Old Man Wilson had always promised to restore. But the Wilson farm, the red barn, the farmhouse with the weather vane, all of it, had burned to the ground during a violent electrical storm 5 years ago. The fire had spread so quickly that firefighters couldn't save any of the structures. The property had been abandoned ever since, with only the stone foundation and chimney still standing as eerie reminders. Mason's hands tightened slightly on the handlebars as the realization settled over him. Either Lily was confused about where she lived, or something much stranger was happening. My tire swing is the best part, Lily continued cheerfully. It hangs from the big oak tree. Do you want to see it when we find my house? The big oak tree. Mason remembered it clearly. The massive tree that had stood in the Wilsons' front yard for generations. It had been struck by lightning during that same storm, split right down the middle. A cold knot formed in Mason's stomach. The farm this child was describing so vividly, with such innocent detail, had not existed for years. Mason took a slow, deep breath to steady himself. The little girl sitting in front of him couldn't possibly be describing a place that had been gone for years. There had to be a simple explanation. Maybe her family had moved recently, and she was mixing up memories of different homes. Or perhaps she'd heard stories about the old Wilson place from someone in town. Lily, Mason said gently, do you remember how long you've lived at your farm? The little girl tilted her helmet-covered head thoughtfully. Forever, since I was a baby. Mason nodded, even though she couldn't see him. And your mom, what's her name? Mommy, Lily answered matter-of-factly, then giggled. But Daddy calls her Claire. Claire. The name didn't immediately ring any bells for Mason. He'd been away from Willow Creek for many years, only returning occasionally to visit Emily's grave. The town's residents were mostly strangers to him now. Claire, Mason repeated. And what about your dad? His name is Daddy, Lily said with another giggle. But Mommy calls him Michael. Mason frowned slightly. Michael and Claire. He tried to remember if the Wilsons had any grown children who might have returned to rebuild on the old property, but surely he would have noticed construction while passing through on his visits. The road curved around a hill, and Mason could see Willow Creek in the distance. The water tower, Lily's giant lollipop, stood tall against the darkening sky. Lily, when did you get lost today? Was it a long time ago? After lunch, she said. Mommy was getting groceries from the car, and I saw a butterfly. It was yellow and pretty. I followed it down the road. Her small shoulders slumped. Mommy tells me not to wander, but I forgot. Mason nodded. That made sense. She'd wandered away from her mother earlier today. But the rest of her story still troubled him. No one lived at the old Wilson place. The property had stood empty and overgrown for years. Are there any other things you remember about today? Before you saw the butterfly? Lily was quiet for a moment, thinking. We went to the store. Mommy bought apples for pie, and I got a lollipop because I was good. She paused. Then we drove home in our blue car. A blue car. It wasn't much, but it was something concrete that might help identify her family. "That's really helpful, Lily," Mason said. "We're almost to town now." The motorcycle crested a small hill, and the lights of Willow Creek appeared before them. Though barely more than a few streets of businesses and homes, the town looked cozy and welcoming in the fading daylight. Mason felt Lily shift excitedly in front of him. "I know this place," she exclaimed. "Mommy brings me here sometimes." That was a good sign. At least Willow Creek was familiar to her. "Lily, I'm going to take you to a place called the Maple Leaf Diner," Mason explained. "It's where lots of people from town go. Someone there might know your mom and dad." "Do they have ice cream?" Lily asked hopefully. Mason smiled. "I bet they do." As they approached the town limits, Mason slowed the motorcycle even further. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of Lily's story. Maybe she'd gotten confused about which farm she lived on. Children often mixed up details. Still, the precision of her description bothered him. The red barn, the weather vane, the tire swing on the oak tree, all specific details of a place that no longer existed. The main street of Willow Creek appeared ahead, lined with old-fashioned lampposts and brick storefronts. Even in the early evening, several cars were parked along the street. The Maple Leaf Diner stood at the corner, its windows glowing warmly. Through the large front window, Mason could see figures moving about inside. It was dinner time, and the diner would be filled with locals. "We're going to stop here," Mason told Lily, as he guided the motorcycle toward the diner's small parking lot. "Someone inside will know how to help us find your mom." "Okay," Lily agreed easily. Her initial fear seemed completely forgotten now, replaced by childlike trust. Mason parked the motorcycle carefully and helped Lily remove the oversized helmet. Her blonde curls sprang free, slightly matted from the helmet. Her bright eyes took in the diner with interest. "Ready to go inside?" Mason asked, offering his hand. Lily nodded and slipped her tiny hand into his large, calloused one. "I'm hungry." "Me too," Mason said with a small smile. "Let's go see if they can help us find your mom." With the mysterious little girl beside him, Mason walked toward the brightly lit diner, hoping someone inside would recognize Lily and solve the strange puzzle of her impossible home. Mason guided his motorcycle into the small parking lot of the Maple Leaf Diner. The engine rumbled to a stop, and he felt Lily shift excitedly in front of him. Through the large windows, the golden light spilled out onto the sidewalk. Inside, the dinner crowd filled the booths and tables, farmers, shopkeepers, and families enjoying their evening meals. "Ready to go in?" Mason asked, helping Lily off the bike. She nodded, clutching the oversized hoodie around her small shoulders. The sleeves hung well past her hands, giving her a comically swallowed appearance. Mason knelt down and carefully rolled them up so her hands were free. "Better?" he asked. "Mm-hmm." Lily wiggled her fingers. "My tummy's making noise." "Mine too," Mason said with a gentle smile. "Let's get you something to eat while we figure things out." He offered his hand, and Lily took it without hesitation. Her tiny fingers wrapped around his weathered palm with complete trust. The transformation from their first meeting, when she'd shrunk away in fear, to this simple gesture of confidence touched something deep inside Mason. For a brief moment, he thought of Emily. She would have been about Lily's age when... Mason pushed the memory away. Focus on the child who needs help now. The bell above the diner door jingled as they walked in. The warm aroma of fresh coffee and baking pies enveloped them immediately. Mason had forgotten how comforting a small-town diner could smell, like cinnamon, butter, and something indefinably homey. The buzz of conversation didn't stop immediately, but it quieted as several patrons glanced towards the door. Mason felt the familiar weight of curious stares. His leather vest with the Iron Lantern Motorcycle Club patch always drew attention in places like this. The diner had changed little in the years since Mason had last visited. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, while a long counter with spinning stools ran along the opposite wall. Above the grill, a vintage clock shaped like a coffee cup ticked away the minutes. Old black and white photos of Willow Creek hung on wood-paneled walls, showing the town's history through the decades. Lily's eyes widened as she took in the scene. "It's pretty in here," she whispered loudly. A few diners smiled at her comment, their expressions softening as they noticed the little girl holding the biker's hand. Mason spotted an empty booth near the back and began guiding Lily toward it, aware of the curious glances following them. An older couple at a nearby table exchanged whispers. A man at the counter turned on his stool to watch them pass. Mason kept his eyes forward, his face neutral. He was used to this kind of attention. "Can I have pancakes?" Lily asked, her voice carrying in the momentary lull of conversation. "Mommy lets me have pancakes for dinner sometimes." "If they're still serving breakfast, sure," Mason said, smiling down at her. He spotted menus tucked behind the napkin holder on their table. "Let's see what they've got." They slid into the booth, Lily bouncing slightly on the squeaky vinyl seat. Her feet dangled well above the floor. She peered over the table's edge with interest at everything around her. "Where's your mommy and daddy?" asked a little boy about Lily's age from the next booth over. His mother quietly shushed him, shooting an apologetic glance toward Mason. "I got lost," Lily announced matter-of-factly. "But then Mr. Mason found me. He has a really cool motorcycle." She looked up at Mason with complete admiration. "He's helping me find Mommy." The mother's expression changed from embarrassment to concern. She looked at Mason with new interest, clearly trying to decide what to make of the situation. Before anyone could ask more questions, movement near the counter caught Mason's attention. An elderly waitress emerged from the kitchen carrying a coffee pot. Her silver hair was pinned neatly in a bun, and she wore a pale blue uniform with "Margaret" stitched on the pocket. Deep lines around her eyes crinkled as she smiled at customers while refilling their cups. "That's Margaret," a man at the counter told his companion. "Been working here since before I was born. Makes the best apple pie in 3 counties. Margaret made her way around the diner with practiced ease, nodding at regulars and exchanging brief pleasantries. When she turned toward their corner of the room, her eyes landed first on Mason, then shifted to Lily. The change in her expression was immediate and dramatic. Her weathered face went pale, and her eyes widened in shock. The coffee pot in her hand tilted dangerously as her grip loosened. "Oh, my Lord," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible across the diner. The pot slipped further in her trembling hand, coffee sloshing close to the rim. For a moment, it seemed certain she would drop it entirely. The coffee pot in Margaret's hand wobbled dangerously. A young busboy noticed and rushed forward, gently taking it from her grip before it could spill. "You okay, Miss Margaret?" he asked, concerned. Margaret didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on Lily, who was now coloring on a paper placemat with crayons she'd found in the menu holder. The normal dinner chatter had died down. One by one, conversations fell silent as diners noticed Margaret's reaction. The clink of silverware against plates slowed. Even the sizzle from the grill seemed to quiet, as if the entire diner held its breath. Mason shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced from Margaret to Lily, then back again, trying to make sense of the waitress's shocked expression. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked quietly. Margaret took a small, unsteady step toward their booth. Then another. Her hand fluttered to her throat, resting there as if to steady herself. "That child," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That little girl." Lily looked up from her coloring, sensing she was the center of attention. Her small face brightened with a smile. "Hello," she said simply, waving a red crayon. Margaret's weathered hand trembled as she reached for the edge of the table to steady herself. The diner had grown so quiet that the sound of the old wall clock ticking seemed thunderous. Several patrons had half risen from their seats, unsure if they should approach or stay back. "I'm sorry," Mason said, keeping his voice low and calm despite his growing confusion. "We didn't mean to cause any trouble. I found her alone by the roadside. She's lost, and I'm just trying to help her find her mother." Margaret didn't seem to hear him. She sank slowly into the empty seat across from them, her eyes never leaving Lily's face. Up close, Mason could see tears forming at the corners of the elderly woman's eyes. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, her voice quavering. "I'm Lily," the child answered brightly. "I'm 5. She held up 5 fingers to demonstrate, then pointed at Mason. "He helped me. I was scared, but he's nice." Margaret's gaze shifted briefly to Mason, assessing him with new interest, then back to Lily. "And where's your mommy, Lily?" "At our farm, with the red barn and the chickens." Lily returned to her coloring, adding yellow to what appeared to be the sun in her drawing. "I got lost looking for her." A murmur rippled through the diner. Several people exchanged meaningful glances. An older man at the counter shook his head slowly. Mason leaned forward. "Ma'am," he said gently to Margaret, "the thing is, when Lily described where she lives, I realized she's talking about the old Sullivan place, the farm with the red barn that burned down years ago." Margaret nodded slowly, never taking her eyes off Lily. "5 years ago," she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "During the worst storm this county's seen in 50 years. Mason's brow furrowed. "I don't understand what's happening here. Do you know this child?" Margaret reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a tissue. She dabbed at her eyes, then carefully folded it in her lap. Her hands were still shaking. "Not exactly," she said. She looked around the diner, noticing for the first time how quiet it had become, how many eyes were watching them. She lowered her voice further. "But everyone in Willow Creek knows about the little girl who went missing during that terrible storm." Mason felt a chill run down his spine. "Missing?" Margaret nodded, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "The night the Sullivan farm burned down, lightning struck the barn. The family barely escaped the fire." She swallowed hard. "Except for their daughter." Lily continued coloring, humming softly to herself, oblivious to the weight of Margaret's words. "The storm was so bad, the roads flooded. Search parties couldn't get through for days," Margaret continued. "They never found her body. Some folks thought maybe she ran into the woods, got lost in the confusion." She reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of touching Lily's hand. "And now here you are," she whispered, "with a little girl who looks exactly like Annie Sullivan." The diner came alive with hushed whispers, like wind rustling through dry leaves. Chairs scraped against the worn linoleum floor as customers rose from their tables, curiosity drawing them toward Mason and Lily's booth. Margaret's revelation about Annie Sullivan had spread through the room in seconds. "Could it really be her?" a woman in a floral apron whispered to her husband. "After all this time?" An elderly man with suspenders muttered, shaking his head. "That's impossible." Mason felt the weight of their stares. Some looked at Lily with wonder, others at him with suspicion. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the attention but determined to stay calm for Lily's sake. The little girl continued coloring, her small hand gripping the crayon tightly as she concentrated on staying inside the lines. "Look at that birthmark," a middle-aged woman pointed, her voice carrying across the diner. Annie had the same pink mark on her wrist. Mason glanced down. Sure enough, a small pink birthmark shaped like a crescent moon decorated Lily's inner wrist. His stomach tightened. This was getting stranger by the minute. Margaret reached across the table with trembling fingers and gently touched Lily's golden curls. "The same hair," she whispered. "The same eyes." A burly man in overalls pushed his way through the gathering crowd. "Hold on now," he said, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. "This don't make a lick of sense. Annie Sullivan would be, 10 years old now. This little girl's half that age." 5, Lily announced proudly, looking up from her drawing. "I'm this many." She held up her hand, fingers splayed. The diner fell silent again. Mason cleared his throat. "Look, I don't know what's happening here, but this child needs help finding her mother. That's all I know." A thin man with wire-rimmed glasses leaned closer. "Where exactly did you find her, mister?" "On County Road 16, Mason answered, sitting alone on the shoulder, crying. "County Road 16 runs right past where the Sullivan farm used to be," someone noted. The crowd pressed closer. Mason instinctively shifted, placing himself between them and Lily. He didn't like how this was unfolding. Too many eyes. Too many questions. Lily sensed the tension. Her crayon stopped moving, and she looked up at Mason with worried eyes. "Are they mad at me?" she whispered. "No, sweetheart," Mason assured her, his voice gentle despite his growing unease. "No one's mad at you." Margaret stood up suddenly, clapping her hands together. "That's enough, all of you. You're scaring the child." Her authority as the diner's longtime fixture was immediate. The crowd reluctantly took a step back. "What we need is Bill," said a woman with salt and pepper hair pulled into a tight bun. "He was sheriff when the Sullivan farm burned. He'd know what to do." "Bill retired last year," Margaret corrected. "It's his nephew Tom who's sheriff now." A rancher in a dusty hat standing near the counter pulled out his cell phone. "I'm calling Tom," he announced. "This ain't something we should handle ourselves. Little girl gone missing years ago suddenly shows up with a stranger passing through town. Sheriff needs to know." Several people nodded in agreement. Mason tensed, but said nothing. He understood their concern, even if it made his position uncomfortable. "I just want to find her mother," he explained, looking around at the faces that studied him with a mixture of wonder and doubt. "I stopped to help a lost child, that's all." "Maybe so," said the rancher, phone already to his ear. "But we need to do this properly. Sheriff can sort it all out." Margaret returned to the booth with a chocolate milkshake, setting it gently in front of Lily. "Here you go, sweetheart. On the house." She turned to Mason with an apologetic smile. "Tom's a good man. He'll handle this right." Mason nodded, resigned to the situation. He watched Lily's face light up at the sight of the milkshake. Whatever strange coincidence had brought them here, his only concern was making sure she was safe. "Sheriff's on his way," the rancher announced, pocketing his phone. "Said to keep everyone right where they are." The diner's normal evening bustle had transformed into a tense vigil. Customers who'd come for meatloaf and apple pie now huddled in groups, stealing glances at the strange pair. The intimidating biker, and the small girl who might be the answer to a 5-year-old mystery. Mason sat quietly in the red vinyl booth, his large frame making the seat look smaller than it was. The iron lantern patch on his leather vest caught the overhead light whenever he shifted. He kept his hands visible on the table, understanding without being told that his appearance made people nervous. Everything about him, from his full beard to his weathered boots, screamed outsider in this close-knit farming community. "So you just happened to be riding by?" asked the rancher, who'd called the sheriff. He leaned against a nearby table, arms crossed over his chest. "Yes, sir," Mason replied evenly. His voice was surprisingly soft for a man his size. I was heading back from Riverdale, taking the scenic route." "What were you doing in Riverdale?" another man chimed in. Mason's eyes flickered briefly with something like pain before he answered. "Personal business?" Margaret appeared with a steaming mug of coffee, placing it before Mason. "Leave him be, Frank," she scolded the questioning rancher. "The man's already explained himself 3 times. Mason nodded gratefully at Margaret. "I appreciate that." Lily had finished half her milkshake, leaving a chocolate mustache above her upper lip. She kicked her legs under the table, seemingly unaware of the tension surrounding her. The crayons Margaret had provided kept her occupied as she worked on her drawing. "I was just riding through," Mason continued, addressing the room more than any specific person. "Saw her sitting there crying. What was I supposed to do? Just drive past?" The question hung in the air, challenging anyone to say they would have done differently. An elderly woman near the counter spoke up. No decent person would leave a child alone on that road. Her words seemed to ease some of the suspicion in the room. "I tried asking where she lived," Mason explained, his fingers wrapped around the warm coffee mug. "She kept talking about a red barn farm with chickens and a tire swing. Said her mom bakes apple pies there." He paused, looking at Margaret. "That's when I remembered hearing about the old Sullivan place that burned down years back." 5 years ago next month," Margaret confirmed. "Lightning strike during the worst storm we'd had in decades." Her eyes drifted to Lily, who was now carefully coloring something blue on her paper. "Little Annie was never found." "I thought maybe someone had rebuilt," Mason said. "Or maybe she was confused about where she lives. Kids that age don't always get details right." "My mommy makes the best apple pies," Lily announced, without looking up from her drawing. "With cinnamon on top." The simple declaration sent another ripple of murmurs through the diner. "Sally Sullivan was known for her apple pies," someone whispered. "Won the county fair 3 years running." Mason took a slow sip of his coffee, watching the reactions around the room. "Look, I don't know what's happening here. I just found a scared little girl who needed help. That's all I know for certain." The bell above the diner door jingled, and everyone turned, expecting the sheriff. Instead, a young couple entered, stopping short when they sensed the unusual atmosphere. "What's going on?" the man asked, looking confused. The rancher waved them to a corner table. "Sheriff's coming. Just wait there, Dave." The mention of the sheriff seemed to trigger something in Lily. Her crayon stopped moving, and she looked up at Mason with worried eyes. "Are you in trouble?" she asked, her voice small but clear in the now quiet diner. Mason shook his head. "No, sweetheart. The sheriff just wants to help us find your mom." Lily's lower lip trembled slightly. "Are you going to leave?" The question caught Mason off guard. Before he could answer, Lily slipped out from her side of the booth and climbed in beside Mason. Her small body pressed against his side as she clutched his leather sleeve with both hands. "Don't go," she whispered, looking up at him with complete trust in her eyes. "You're the only one who doesn't look at me funny." Mason gently patted her hand. "I'm not going anywhere until we find your mom. Promise." The sight of the frightened child clinging to the rough biker created a visible shift in the room. The suspicion in some eyes softened, replaced by uncertainty and, in a few cases, something that looked like compassion. Margaret watched from behind the counter, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. Whatever mysteries surrounded Lily's appearance, one thing seemed clear. The child trusted Mason completely. And in Margaret's 68 years of reading people, she'd learned that children often saw things more clearly than adults ever could. The hum of whispered conversations filled the diner as Margaret emerged from the kitchen, balancing a small tray. Her weathered hands moved with practiced grace as she approached Mason and Lily's booth. The elderly waitress's face had softened considerably since her initial shock. "Here we go, sweetheart," Margaret said, placing a perfectly golden grilled cheese sandwich in front of Lily. Steam rose from the melted cheddar peeking out between the crisp bread. Next to it, she set down a small plate with a generous slice of apple pie, the crust flaky and golden brown. "And a little something sweet for after." Lily's eyes widened at the sight. She remained pressed against Mason's side, but leaned forward eagerly. "What do we say?" Mason prompted gently. "Thank you," Lily replied, her voice small but clear. She reached for the sandwich with both hands, the paper drawing forgotten beside her chocolate milkshake. Margaret smiled, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. "You're very welcome." She turned to Mason. "Coffee still warm enough for you?" Mason nodded. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." Margaret lingered by the table, her experienced eyes taking in the unusual pair. The massive biker with his leather vest and the tiny girl in an oversized hoodie made for a strange sight. Yet there was something about the way Mason kept his movements slow and deliberate around Lily. The careful way he made sure she was comfortable. That told Margaret more than words could. "Sheriff should be here soon," Margaret said quietly. "He was out at the Peterson farm when we called." Mason nodded again. "No rush. We're okay here, aren't we, Lily?" The little girl looked up from her sandwich, a smudge of melted cheese on her chin. "This is yummy," she announced, swinging her legs under the table. Margaret chuckled. "Been making that same grilled cheese recipe for 40 years. Secret's a touch of garlic powder in the butter." She winked at Lily before returning to her other customers. The diner had settled into an uneasy calm. Most people had returned to their meals, though occasional glances still landed on Mason and Lily. The initial suspicion had eased somewhat, replaced by curiosity and confusion. "We'll find your mom soon," Mason assured Lily, his deep voice soft enough that only she could hear him. "The sheriff will help us. He knows everybody around here." Lily took another bite of her sandwich, seemingly unconcerned now that food was in front of her. "My tummy was making growly noises," she confided. "Mine too," Mason admitted with a small smile. "Been riding most of the day." "On your big motorcycle?" Lily asked, her eyes brightening. "It's so loud, like a dragon." Mason's face softened at her enthusiasm. "Yeah, it can be pretty loud." "I liked riding on it," Lily said, reaching for her milkshake, even if it was scary at first. She took a long sip through her straw, leaving another chocolate mustache above her lip. Mason reached for a napkin and gently wiped the chocolate away. The gesture came naturally to him, though it drew a few surprised looks from the other diners. Lily finished her sandwich and eyed the apple pie. "Can I have this now?" she asked. "Sure thing," Mason said, sliding the plate closer to her. "Careful, it might still be hot in the middle." Lily picked up her fork and carefully broke off a small piece of pie. The rich scent of cinnamon and apples wafted up. After blowing on it carefully, she took a bite and closed her eyes in delight. "It's like my mommy's pie," she declared, "but different too." "Different how?" Mason asked, genuinely curious. Lily considered this question with the seriousness only a child could muster. "Mommy puts more cinnamon, and sometimes raisins." She made a face. "I don't like the raisins," Mason chuckled softly. "Not a raisin fan myself." The normal sounds of the diner, forks against plates, ice clinking in glasses, the sizzle of the grill from the kitchen, created a comforting background. For a moment, it almost felt like they were just a normal pair having dinner, not the center of a growing mystery. Lily took another bite of pie, then looked up at Mason with wide, innocent eyes. "Do you have kids?" she asked suddenly. The question caught Mason completely off guard. His fork, which had been idly tracing patterns on his unused napkin, went still. His expression shifted, a shadow passing over his face as he paused, suddenly lost in thought. Mason's face grew still as Lily's innocent question hung in the air between them. His weathered hands, dotted with small scars from years of mechanical work, tensed slightly around his coffee cup. "No, sweetheart," he finally answered, his voice gentler than before. "I don't have any kids." Lily nodded, accepting his answer with a child's simple understanding before returning her attention to the apple pie. She hummed a little tune to herself as she ate, swinging her feet beneath the table. Margaret approached their booth again, coffee pot in hand. She noticed the change in Mason's demeanor immediately. Years of reading people across her counter had given her an almost uncanny ability to sense emotional shifts. "Everything all right with the food?" she asked, her question clearly about more than just the meal. Mason nodded. "The food's great. She's enjoying it." Margaret filled his cup, then slid into the booth across from them. The diner had quieted somewhat, giving her a moment to sit. "Mind if I join you for a minute? These old legs need a rest now and then." Mason gestured to the seat with a welcoming hand. "Please." Lily was absorbed in her pie, carefully separating the crust from the filling with methodical focus that only children can bring to dessert. Her presence created a small bubble of innocence amid the tension of the situation. "You're good with her," Margaret observed quietly. "Not everyone would know what to do with a lost child." Mason's eyes remained on Lily as he spoke. "Had practice once," he admitted, his voice so low Margaret had to lean forward slightly to hear him. "Long time ago." There was something in his tone that made Margaret wait patiently, giving him space to continue if he chose to. The clock above the counter ticked steadily, marking the passing seconds. "Had a little sister," Mason finally said. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup. "Emily. She was 7 when—" He paused, taking a deep breath. "When she wandered away from our yard, near a road." Understanding dawned on Margaret's face. "Oh, my dear," she whispered. "I was supposed to be watching her." The words seemed to physically pain him. "Just 16. Thought I could text my friends for 5 minutes and she'd be fine." Mason's eyes grew distant. 5 minutes was all it took. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The gesture was maternal, instinctive. "I was the one who found her," Mason continued, his voice steadier now but hollow. "By the side of the road. Driver never even stopped." He glanced at Lily, making sure she wasn't listening. The little girl was now drawing on her paper placemat with crayons Margaret had brought earlier, lost in her own world. "That's why I had to stop today. Couldn't just ride past and hope someone else would help." Margaret's eyes softened with compassion. "How long ago?" 15 years this spring," Mason replied. "Never goes away. That feeling that I failed her." "And you've carried that all this time," Margaret said softly. It wasn't a question. Mason nodded once, then straightened his shoulders slightly, as if physically setting the memory aside. "Helping Lily feels, I don't know, like maybe Emily sent her my way. Sounds foolish, I guess." "Not foolish at all," Margaret assured him, her voice warm with understanding. "Not one bit." Their conversation was interrupted by the diner's front door swinging open. A stocky man in a sheriff's deputy uniform entered, scanning the room before spotting Mason and Lily. His hand rested instinctively on his belt as he approached their table. "This the situation I heard about?" he asked Margaret, his eyes moving between the biker and the child. Before Mason could speak, Margaret rose from the booth with surprising quickness. "Tom, this is Mason," she said firmly. He found this little girl alone on County Road 8 and brought her here for help. A few of the locals had gathered closer, their expressions ranging from curious to suspicious. A balding man in overalls muttered something about those biker types, just loud enough to be heard. Margaret turned, her spine straightening as she addressed not just the deputy but the entire diner. "This man," she said, pointing to Mason, "stopped to help a scared child when anyone else might have just driven on by." Her voice carried the weight of her 40 years as the heart of this community. "He's been nothing but gentle and patient with her while we wait for help." "Still," the deputy began, "You should probably thank him," Margaret interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Because that's what we do in Willow Creek when someone helps one of our own." A surprised silence fell over the diner. Margaret rarely spoke with such authority. But when she did, people listened. "The child trusts him completely," she continued, gesturing to Lily, who was now leaning against Mason's side as she drew, completely at ease. "Children know who they can trust. Maybe we adults should remember how to see that clearly too." The diner's bell jingled as the front door swung open. Sheriff Dan Holbrook entered, removing his hat as he stepped inside. He was a tall man, with salt and pepper hair and deep smile lines around his eyes that spoke of a kind nature beneath his official exterior. His deputy, a younger man named Rodriguez, followed close behind. The murmurs in the diner quieted as the sheriff made his way to the booth where Mason, Lily, and Margaret sat. Unlike some of the townspeople, Sheriff Holbrook's expression showed no immediate judgment, just professional curiosity. "Evening, Margaret," he said with a nod, before turning his attention to Mason. "I'm Sheriff Holbrook. Mind if we have a word?" Mason nodded calmly. "No problem, Sheriff." Lily looked up from her drawing, her eyes growing wide at the sight of the uniformed men. She inched closer to Mason's side, her small hand clutching the edge of his leather vest. "Who's this young lady?" Sheriff Holbrook asked, his voice gentler as he addressed Lily. Before Mason could answer, Margaret spoke up. "This is Lily. Mason here found her alone on County Road 8 and brought her in for help." The sheriff pulled out a small notepad from his shirt pocket. "Mind if I sit down?" When Mason nodded, Sheriff Holbrook slid into the booth across from them while Deputy Rodriguez remained standing. "So, Mason," the sheriff began, his tone professional but not unfriendly, "can you tell me exactly where and when you found Lily today?" Mason spoke clearly, keeping his hands visible on the table. "About 2 hours ago, just past the old Miller property on County Road 8. She was sitting alone on the gravel shoulder crying. No vehicles or people anywhere nearby that I could see." The sheriff made notes, then looked at Lily, who was now half hiding behind Mason's arm. "Has she said anything about her family or where she lives?" "She mentioned a farm with a red barn and chickens," Mason explained. "Talked about her mom baking apple pies. But when she described the place in detail, it sounded like the old Peterson farm that burned down years back." Sheriff Holbrook's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's interesting." He turned to his deputy. "Rodriguez, check if we've had any reports of missing children today." The deputy nodded and stepped outside to use his radio. Lily tugged on Mason's sleeve, her voice a whisper, but audible to the others. "Are they going to take me away?" Mason looked down at her, his rough face softening. "They're just trying to help find your mom, sweetheart. That's all." The sheriff watched this exchange with thoughtful eyes before continuing. "Mason, I don't believe I've seen you around Willow Creek before." "I pass through sometimes," Mason replied. "Member of the Iron Lantern MC. We're based out of Riverdale, about 80 miles east." A few people in the diner exchanged glances at the mention of the motorcycle club, but the sheriff merely nodded. "Iron Lantern," he repeated. "They run that toy drive for the children's hospital at Christmas, don't they?" Surprise flickered across Mason's face. "Yes, sir. Going on 12 years now. The diner door opened again as Deputy Rodriguez returned, making his way quickly to the sheriff. He leaned down and spoke quietly into Holbrook's ear. The sheriff nodded, then turned back to Mason. "We've got no reports of missing children today in the county," he said, "which is concerning given that this little one is clearly separated from her family." Lily's eyes began to well with tears. "I want my mommy," she whispered, her lower lip trembling. The sheriff's face filled with genuine concern. "We'll find her, sweetheart. Don't you worry." Mason gently placed his hand on Lily's shoulder. "It's okay, Lily. The sheriff's going to help us. He's one of the good guys." The sheriff continued, his voice still gentle but official. "I'm going to need to take a formal statement, Mason. Standard procedure. And we'll need to get Lily's full name and any other details she might remember." Lily's breathing quickened, her small chest rising and falling rapidly as she stared at the sheriff's badge. Her fingers dug into Mason's arm. "They have guns," she whispered fearfully to Mason, her eyes fixed on the officer's holstered weapons. Mason turned in the booth to face her directly, blocking her view of the officers. He lowered his voice to a gentle rumble that somehow filled the small space between them with calm. "Lily, look at me," he said softly. Her frightened eyes met his. "Those are just tools for their job, like I have tools for my motorcycle. They help people with them. The sheriff and his deputy are here to help find your mom, that's all." He held out his pinky finger to her. "I promise everything's going to be all right. I'm not going anywhere until we find your mom, okay?" Lily hesitated, then slowly wrapped her tiny pinky around his. "Pinky promise?" "Pinky promise," Mason confirmed with a solemn nod. Sheriff Holbrook continued thumbing through a thick binder of missing persons records while Deputy Rodriguez made phone calls from the diner's corner. Mason sat patiently in the booth with Lily, who was now coloring on a paper place mat with crayons Margaret had found behind the counter. The diner had grown quieter, but curious eyes still drifted toward the strange pair, the rough-looking biker, and the small girl who clung to him like a lifeline. 3 younger residents of Willow Creek, a newlywed couple named Sarah and Tom Miller, and the town's new high school teacher, David Chen, had gathered at the counter, whispering among themselves. "I don't understand," Sarah said softly. "Why does Margaret look like she's seen a ghost?" Margaret overheard the question as she refilled coffee cups nearby. She paused, coffee pot in hand, and glanced over at Lily before approaching their corner of the counter. "You 3 weren't living here 5 years ago," Margaret said, setting the coffee pot down. She leaned forward, resting her weathered hands on the countertop. "That storm changed this town." The 3 younger people leaned in, drawn by the heaviness in her voice. "What storm?" David asked. Margaret's eyes drifted toward the diner windows. "It was early October, just like now. A storm blew in from nowhere, the kind that makes you think the sky is angry. Lightning struck all over the county." She poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands steady despite the weight of the memory. "The Peterson farm, the one with the red barn this little girl described, it caught fire when lightning hit the main house. The whole place went up within an hour. Joe and Ellen Peterson barely made it out alive." Tom furrowed his brow. "But what does that have to do with the little girl Mason found today?" Margaret took a sip of her coffee before continuing, her voice dropping lower. "The Petersons were watching their granddaughter that weekend. Ellen had just taken her for the day while her daughter, their daughter-in-law, was at work in the city." The 3 listeners glanced toward Lily, who was happily coloring, oblivious to the story being told. During the chaos of the fire and the storm, nobody could find the child. The fire department searched what was left of that farm for 3 days. The whole town joined in, combing every inch of those fields. "They never found her?" Sarah whispered, her hand unconsciously moving to her heart. Margaret shook her head slowly. Never. 5 years ago this month. Her name was Emma Peterson. She was 5 years old. David's eyes widened. And this girl? Lily. She described the farm perfectly? How is that possible if it burned down 5 years ago? That's what has us all spooked, Margaret admitted. That and the resemblance. The three younger residents looked confused. The resemblance? Tom asked. Margaret nodded toward Lily. Take a good look at her, then look at that. She pointed to a community bulletin board near the diner entrance. Among the flyers and announcements hung a faded missing child poster with the photo of a smiling little girl with blonde curls, Sarah gasped softly. They could be twins. That poster's been hanging there for 5 years, Margaret said. I've never had the heart to take it down. Ellen Peterson died of a heart attack a year after the fire. Joe moved to Arizona to live with his son, but that little girl's mother never gave up hope. The three young people stared at the poster, then back at Lily, who was showing Mason her colorful drawing. It can't be the same child, David reasoned. This Lily must have heard stories about the farm from someone. Maybe, Margaret said, unconvinced. But how does she know about the tire swing that Joe hung from the oak tree, or the exact pattern of the chicken coop doors? Those details weren't in the newspapers. A chill seemed to settle over the diner as this information spread in whispers from table to table. Even those who hadn't lived in Willow Creek during the storm felt the uneasiness that permeated the air. Sheriff Holbrook closed his binder and approached Mason's booth again, unaware of the story Margaret had just shared. No matching reports in the system, he announced. We're expanding the search to neighboring counties now. But the townspeople were no longer just concerned about finding Lily's family. They were now unsettled by the impossible coincidence before them. A child describing a place that no longer existed, bearing an uncanny resemblance to a little girl who had vanished on a stormy night 5 years earlier. The wall clock in the Maple Leaf Diner ticked past 7 in the evening. Outside, twilight had settled over Willow Creek, painting the main street in soft purple shadows. Inside, the atmosphere remained tense, but had shifted from outright suspicion to quiet curiosity. Sheriff Holbrook sat at the counter, phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with authorities from the neighboring county. His deep voice rumbled in short, professional phrases, while his deputy continued making notes in a small spiral notebook. At their booth by the window, Mason remained surprisingly calm, despite being the center of the town's attention. He sat with his back straight, occasionally glancing around the diner, but mostly keeping his focus on Lily. The little girl had stopped asking questions about when she could go home and was now fully engaged in an artistic project. Margaret had brought over a stack of paper napkins when she noticed Lily trying to color on the small paper placemat. Now, the child had 5 napkins spread across the table, each one becoming a canvas for her imagination. Her small fingers gripped the blue crayon with determination as she drew careful lines. "What are you making there?" Mason asked, his deep voice gentle. Lily didn't look up, her tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth in concentration. "It's a surprise. Don't look yet." Mason obediently turned his gaze towards the window, watching the headlights of passing cars sweep across the parking lot. His weathered face revealed nothing, but his mind was a storm of emotions. Finding Lily had awakened memories he'd spent years trying to bury. His little sister Emily's laugh, the panic when she went missing, the crushing grief that followed. The bell above the diner door jingled as an elderly man entered, stomping road dust from his boots. He paused when he saw the crowd, then made his way to the counter where Margaret filled him in with whispers. Mason could feel the weight of the newcomer's stare, but didn't react. He'd grown accustomed to people's wariness, his leather vest with the iron lantern patch, his full beard, and the tattoos visible on his forearms. They all told a story to strangers before he ever opened his mouth. Usually that story wasn't a kind one. "I'm done," Lily announced, sitting up straight with pride. She turned the napkin around and pushed it across the table for Mason to see. The crayon drawing was simple but unmistakable. A motorcycle, larger than life, with 2 stick figures riding it. One big, one small. The larger figure wore what looked like a cape flowing behind it. "That's you," she said, pointing to the larger figure. "And that's me. We're on your big motorcycle." Mason leaned closer, studying the colorful creation. "It's real good," he said, a hint of genuine warmth in his voice. "But what's this behind me? Is that a cape?" Lily giggled, the sound like bells in the quiet diner. Several people turned to look, drawn by the child's happiness. "Those are wings," she explained, as if it were the most obvious thing. "Because you rescued me. My mom says people who help others are angels." The innocence in her voice brought a lump to Mason's throat that he struggled to swallow past. "I don't know about that," he said quietly. Lily shook her head firmly. "You are. You found me when I was scared and you helped me. That makes you my road hero." The words hung in the air between them. Simple, yet profound. Mason felt something shift inside him. A tight knot that had been lodged in his chest for years seemed to loosen just a fraction. A small, genuine smile formed on his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. It felt strange, almost foreign, like rediscovering a forgotten path. How long had it been since he'd truly smiled? Not the polite nod he gave to fellow riders, or the forced pleasantries with strangers, but a real smile that came from somewhere deep. "Your road hero, huh?" he repeated softly. "Yep," Lily declared, now working on another napkin drawing. "My very own road hero with the big motorcycle and the wings." The diner had grown quieter as several people overheard their conversation. Margaret stood nearby, coffee pot forgotten in her hand, watching the interaction with softening eyes. Mason carefully folded the napkin drawing and tucked it into the inside pocket of his leather vest, right over his heart. The gesture was gentle, reverent even, as if he were handling something precious. Lily beamed at him, her small face aglow with trust and admiration. "You can keep it forever," she said. "I will," Mason promised, his smile growing warmer, deeper, more genuine than it had been in years. Sheriff Holbrook closed his notebook with a sigh and rubbed his tired eyes. He'd been making calls for over an hour, checking with every nearby county about missing children reports. The fluorescent lights of the Maple Leaf Diner cast harsh shadows across his weathered face as he stood up from his stool at the counter. "No matches in any of the surrounding counties," he announced, his deep voice carrying across the now quiet diner. "No reports of a missing child fitting Lily's description in the last 24 hours. Mason nodded solemnly from the booth where he sat with Lily. The little girl had moved on to her third napkin drawing, this one featuring what appeared to be chickens in a yard. Her small hand moved the crayon with determined concentration, seemingly unaware of the confusion surrounding her identity. Margaret approached their table with a fresh pot of coffee. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, refilling Mason's mug. The sheriff walked over, tucking his notebook into his shirt pocket. "We'll need to contact Child Services. They'll have to take temporary custody while we try to sort this out." He glanced at his watch. Though at this hour, it might take some time for them to send someone. Mason's shoulders tensed visibly. The thought of Lily being handed over to strangers made his stomach knot. He'd been that frightened child once, passed between foster homes after his parents died, before his grandparents finally took him in. "I can stay with her until they come," Mason offered, his voice low. A few of the older farmers at the counter exchanged skeptical glances. The biker's gentle behavior with the child had softened some attitudes, but suspicion still lingered in their eyes. The sheriff considered Mason's offer. "I appreciate that, but regulations require—" His words were cut short by the sudden crash of the diner's front door flying open. It banged against the wall with such force that the bell above it jangled wildly. Everyone in the diner jumped, startled by the noise. A young woman burst through the doorway, her chest heaving as if she'd been running. Her brown hair was coming loose from a ponytail, and her face was flushed and tear-streaked. Her wide eyes frantically scanned the room. "Please," she gasped, her voice breaking. "Has anyone seen a little girl? My daughter? Her name is Lily." The entire diner fell into shocked silence. Every person froze in place, the sheriff with his hand halfway to his belt, Margaret clutching the coffee pot, Mason sitting perfectly still. The woman stepped further inside, desperation etched across her face. She wore jeans and a simple flannel shirt with dirt smudges on the knees. She wandered off near County Road 16 while I was unloading supplies from my truck. She's 5 years old, blonde curls, wearing a pink t-shirt and... Her frantic description halted mid-sentence as her gaze landed on the booth where Lily sat. The woman's eyes widened, filling instantly with tears. "Lily?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. At the sound of her name, Lily looked up from her drawing. For a brief moment, she stared across the diner at the disheveled woman. Then her face transformed with pure joy. "Mommy!" Lily shrieked. The crayon clattered to the table as Lily scrambled from the booth. Her small feet hit the linoleum floor running. She darted past the sheriff and Margaret, her oversized borrowed hoodie flapping behind her like wings as she sprinted across the diner. "Mommy, Mommy!" The young woman dropped to her knees, arms outstretched. Tears streamed freely down her face as Lily crashed into her embrace. The woman wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling her tight against her chest, burying her face in Lily's blonde curls. "Oh, my baby," she sobbed, rocking back and forth. "I was so scared. I've been looking everywhere for you." Lily clung to her mother's neck, small fingers gripping tightly. "I got lost, Mommy, but the angel man found me on his motorcycle." The diner fell silent as Lily and her mother held each other in the middle of the room. The woman's shoulders shook with sobs of relief, while Lily nestled against her, small hands still clutching her mother's shirt, as if afraid to let go. Everyone watched the reunion unfold, the tension that had filled the diner for hours melting away like morning fog under sunshine. Mason stood slowly from the booth, his large frame suddenly uncertain. He watched mother and daughter with a mixture of relief and something deeper, a quiet ache in his chest. For just a brief time, he had been Lily's protector, her angel man, as she called him. Now she was back where she belonged. Sheriff Holbrook stepped forward, clearing his throat softly. "Ma'am? I'm Sheriff Holbrook. We've been trying to locate this little girl's family for the past few hours." The young woman looked up, her face streaked with tears and mascara. She kept one arm firmly around Lily while wiping her eyes with her free hand. "I'm Claire Harper," she said, her voice still trembling. "I've been searching everywhere for her. I called the police, but they said I needed to wait longer before filing a missing person report." She looked back at Lily, gently brushing blonde curls from her daughter's forehead. "I couldn't just wait in the car. I've been driving every back road, stopping at every house and business I could find." Margaret approached with a glass of water, offering it to Claire. "You look like you could use this, honey." Claire accepted it gratefully, taking a sip before setting it on a nearby table. Her hands immediately returned to holding Lily, as though afraid the child might vanish again. "Thank God she's safe," Claire whispered. "When I couldn't find her..." Her voice cracked. The sheriff nodded understandingly. We'll need to get some information from you, just to verify everything. Standard procedure. Claire nodded, finally looking around the diner at all the faces watching them. Who found her? Who brought my daughter here? Mason shifted his weight, suddenly conscious of his intimidating appearance. The leather vest with the motorcycle club patch, the beard, the tattoos visible on his forearms. He raised his hand slightly. That would be me, ma'am. Claire's eyes widened as she took in the sight of him. For a moment, Mason braced himself for the reaction he'd grown accustomed to, the flash of fear, the instinctive pulling away. Instead, Claire carefully set Lily on her feet, whispered something in her ear, and then walked directly to Mason. Without hesitation, she threw her arms around his waist, hugging him tightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Thank you for finding my little girl." Surprised, Mason stood frozen for a moment before awkwardly patting her back. "Anyone would have stopped, ma'am." Claire pulled back, wiping fresh tears. "No, not everyone would." She looked at him with earnest eyes. "You have no idea how many cars drove past us when we got a flat tire earlier today. Not one stopped to help." Lily tugged at her mother's jeans. "Mommy, he gave me his big sweater and let me ride on his motorcycle." She pointed at the oversized hoodie she still wore. "And he bought me grilled cheese and pie." Claire knelt down beside Lily, smoothing the girl's hair. "He sounds like a real hero." "He is," Lily declared, with the absolute certainty only a child could muster. "He's my angel man." The sheriff stepped closer, notepad in hand. "Mrs. Harper, can you tell us exactly what happened today? How Lily got separated from you?" Claire nodded, keeping one hand on Lily's shoulder as she explained. "We were driving back from my sister's place in Oak Ridge. I had to stop on County Road 16 to rearrange some boxes in my truck. They were shifting around too much on those bumpy roads." She sighed, the guilt evident in her eyes. "I was unloading everything, sorting it out on the roadside. Lily was playing nearby and I checked on her every minute. But then I had to crawl into the truck bed to tie down this large suitcase." Claire's voice wavered. "It couldn't have been more than 2 minutes. When I climbed back out, she was gone. Just gone." She hugged Lily close again. "I called and called. I searched the woods nearby. I drove up and down that road a dozen times." Sheriff Holbrook pulled out his notepad and clicked his pen, while Claire sat at a booth with Lily snuggled on her lap. Mason stood nearby, awkwardly shifting his weight from one foot to the other, unsure if he should stay or go. "Mrs. Harper, do you have some identification with you?" the sheriff asked gently. "Just a formality, you understand?" Claire nodded, reaching into her pocket with one hand while keeping the other arm securely around Lily. She pulled out her driver's license and handed it over. "Of course. Here you go." The sheriff studied the ID carefully, comparing the photo to Claire's face. He nodded and handed it back. "Thank you, ma'am." He then crouched down to Lily's level. "Lily, is this your mommy?" Lily looked at the sheriff like he'd asked if the sky was blue. "Of course that's my mommy," she said with a giggle. "She makes the best pancakes ever, and she reads me stories, and she has a special kissing spot right here." Lily pointed to her forehead. Margaret, who had been hovering nearby with her coffee pot, let out a relieved sigh. Several other patrons visibly relaxed, shoulders dropping and tense expressions softening. "Well, that settles that," the sheriff said, straightening up. He turned toward the curious onlookers who had gathered around. "Folks, I know some of you were thinking about Jenny Miller, the little girl who disappeared during the storm 5 years back." His voice grew solemn. "But this is just an unfortunate coincidence. Lily here bears a striking resemblance, but she's Claire Harper's daughter." Mason watched as several older townspeople exchanged glances. Margaret wiped a tear from her eye. "Guess we all wanted closure on that old heartbreak," Margaret said quietly. "Poor Jenny's family moved away after the search was called off. Never did find out what happened to her." Claire looked confused. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. Who's Jenny?" The sheriff shook his head. "A local tragedy from years back. A little girl went missing the same night lightning struck the old Red Barn farm. She was never found." "That's the farm I was describing," Lily piped up. "The one with the chickens and the tire swing." Claire smiled, brushing Lily's hair from her face. "Sweetie, that's from your favorite book, remember? Emma's Red Barn. We read it every night." She looked up at Mason. "She's got quite an imagination. Sometimes she thinks the stories are real places she's been to." Understanding dawned on Mason's face. The mysterious farm Lily had described so vividly wasn't a real place from her memory. It was from a children's book. The realization washed over him with relief. "That explains it," he said softly. The atmosphere in the diner gradually transformed. The suspicion that had greeted Mason when he first walked in with Lily had completely evaporated. Instead, appreciative smiles and nods came his way. A few of the farmers who had eyed him warily earlier now looked embarrassed by their initial reaction. Ed Wilson, the oldest rancher in town who had been particularly suspicious, approached Mason with an outstretched hand. "Seems we owe you an apology, son. Not every day someone stops to help a lost child." Mason shook the weathered hand, nodding silently. He wasn't used to being thanked. Usually, when he walked into places like this diner, people moved away, clutched their purses tighter, or whispered behind their hands. Lily wiggled free from her mother's lap and ran over to Mason, hugging his leg. "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Mason." "Just Mason is fine, kiddo," he said, awkwardly patting her head. "And you're welcome." Margaret brought over a fresh slice of apple pie and set it in front of Mason. "On the house," she said warmly. "What you did today, stopping for that child when nobody else would. That's what matters in this world." Claire watched the interaction with grateful eyes. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found her. These country roads. It gets cold at night." Her voice broke slightly. The diner had completely transformed. The tension that had filled the air when Mason first walked in with Lily was gone, replaced with a warm appreciation. The regular customers returned to their meals. The worried whispers turned to normal conversation. And Mason, the intimidating biker who'd caused such a stir, was now simply a good man who'd done the right thing. The afternoon sunshine slanted through the diner windows, casting long golden rectangles across the checkered floor. The crisis had passed, and the regular rhythm of the Maple Leaf Diner was slowly returning. Silverware clinked against plates, the coffee machine hissed, and conversation hummed at a normal volume. Mason sat alone at his booth, feeling strangely out of place now that the drama had ended. He wasn't used to being in places like this without his riding buddies, and he certainly wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention in a good way. Part of him wanted to finish his pie quickly, pay his bill, and get back on the road where he belonged. He glanced over at Claire and Lily, now sitting at their own table across the diner. The sheriff had finished taking their information and left after giving Mason a respectful nod. Claire was gently wiping smudges of dirt from Lily's face with a damp napkin, while the little girl wiggled impatiently. Mason turned his attention back to his half-eaten pie, figuring the Harpers would want to be on their way soon. He'd done his part, found the girl, brought her to safety, reunited her with her mother. That should be enough. He didn't notice Claire standing up and walking toward him until she was right beside his table. "Do you mind if I sit for a moment?" she asked softly. Mason looked up, surprised. "No, ma'am. Please." He gestured awkwardly to the seat across from him. Claire slid into the booth, her hands clasped together on the table. For a few seconds, she just studied his face, her eyes still red-rimmed from crying earlier. Mason shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "I don't even know how to begin thanking you," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "When I realized Lily was gone." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I've never been so scared in my life." "Anyone would have stopped," Mason mumbled, looking down at his coffee cup. Claire shook her head firmly. "No, that's not true, and we both know it." Tears welled in her eyes again. "3 cars drove right past her before you came along. I saw them from where I was searching up the road." Mason's jaw tightened at this information. The thought of those drivers who'd chosen not to stop for a crying child made his stomach twist. "My daughter was alone, frightened and completely vulnerable," Claire continued, a tear slipping down her cheek. "And you, someone who had every reason to just keep riding by, you stopped. You protected her when nobody else would." Mason swallowed hard, uncomfortable with the praise. "She reminded me of someone," he said quietly. "Your sister?" Claire asked gently. Mason looked up, surprised. "Margaret mentioned it," she explained. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Mason nodded once, unable to speak about Emily. Even after all these years, the guilt still felt like a stone in his chest. "When Lily told me how kind you were, how you gave her your jacket, how you spoke so gently to her." Claire's voice broke. She reached across the table and placed her hand on Mason's weathered one. "You're a good man, Mason Carter. Don't let anyone tell you different because of how you look or what you ride." The warmth of her hand on his was startling. Mason couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him with such genuine gratitude. "Thank you," he managed to say. A small commotion interrupted them as Lily wriggled free from Margaret's watchful eye and bounded across the diner toward their table. "Mommy, can I show Mr. Mason my drawing before we go?" Lily asked, clutching a paper napkin in her small hand. Claire smiled and nodded, making room for her daughter to squeeze in beside her. Lily proudly pushed the napkin across the table. On it was a crayon drawing of a stick figure on what looked like a motorcycle. The figure had messy hair, a beard, and, most surprising of all, a pair of large wings sprouting from its back. "It's you," Lily explained seriously. "But with angel wings because that's what my teacher says people who help others are guardian angels." Mason stared at the drawing, something warm and unfamiliar spreading through his chest. "Do you like it?" Lily asked anxiously when he didn't speak. "I love it," Mason finally said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Thank you, Lily." Without warning, Lily slid out from beside her mother and ran around to Mason's side of the booth. Before he could react, she threw her small arms around his neck in a fierce hug. "You're my hero," she declared loudly enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "You saved me when I was lost and scared." Mason froze for a moment, then carefully wrapped one arm around the tiny girl, patting her back awkwardly. Over Lily's shoulder, he caught Claire's gaze, her eyes shining with tears and gratitude. The hug from Lily lasted only a few seconds, but its impact on Mason would last far longer. As she skipped back to her mother's side, the diner seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had filled the place since Mason first walked in with the lost child had finally broken. Margaret refilled coffee cups, the cook flipped burgers on the grill, and the regular rhythm of small-town life resumed. Most of the customers had turned their attention back to their own meals and conversations, though a few still glanced occasionally at Mason with newfound respect. "We should probably get going," Claire said, gathering her purse. It's been quite a day, and this little one needs a bath and some rest. Mason nodded, understanding. Safe travels, he said simply. Claire stood and took Lily's hand, but before they could walk away, Lily tugged on her mother's arm and whispered something. Claire bent down, listening to her daughter's urgent request, then smiled and nodded. "We'd be honored if you'd stop by our place sometime," Claire said to Mason. "We have a little farmhouse about 20 minutes outside of town. Lily wants to show you her chickens." Mason's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "That's mighty kind of you." As Claire and Lily made their way toward the door, several patrons stopped them to check on Lily or introduce themselves. The town of Willow Creek was embracing them, the outsiders who had briefly become the center of their world. Near the window, a group of older men in worn jeans and dusty work boots huddled around a table. They'd been watching the scene unfold all evening, their weathered faces unreadable. One of them, a tall, wiry rancher with a face like tanned leather, shook his head slowly. "Lucky thing that child's all right," he muttered to his companions, his voice carrying just far enough for nearby tables to hear. "But I still don't trust those biker types. Seen too many of them causing trouble over in Cedar Falls." His words hung in the air, sharp and unexpected after the warmth of the previous moments. A younger man at the table frowned. "Oh, come on, Bill. That ain't fair. You saw how he was with the little girl." The rancher snorted. "One good deed don't erase what those gangs get up to. Mark my words, those iron whatever they call themselves are probably running drugs or worse." Mason heard every word clearly. His shoulders tensed slightly, but his face remained calm. He'd heard such comments his whole life with the club. The judgment stung more tonight somehow, after everything that had happened. Margaret appeared beside Mason's table, coffee pot in hand. She'd heard the rancher, too, and her lips were pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Don't you pay Bill Henderson any mind," she said firmly, loud enough for the rancher to hear. "That old goat's been suspicious of anyone who wasn't born in this town since 1962. She topped off Mason's coffee with a defiant flourish. Mason gave her a small, grateful smile. "It's all right. I'm used to it." "Well, you shouldn't be," Margaret insisted. "Not after what you did today." Mason glanced around the diner. Most folks were watching this exchange curiously. Some looked embarrassed by the rancher's words. Others seemed uncertain, their gazes flicking between Mason's leather vest with its iron lantern patch and the little girl now waiting by the door. Mason reached for his wallet, but Margaret shook her head firmly. "Your money's no good here today. This one's on the house." "That's not necessary," Mason began. "Maybe not," Margaret interrupted, "but it's what's right. And we do what's right in Willow Creek." She gave the rancher's table a pointed look before walking away, her back straight and dignified. Mason sat quietly for a moment, finishing his coffee. He could feel the weight of the diner's attention, some supportive, some still wary. The rancher had voiced what others might still be thinking, that a man like Mason couldn't really be trusted, that his appearance told the full story. Without hurry, Mason rose from the booth. He gave a polite nod to the room at large, his movements calm and deliberate. At the counter, he left a generous tip, despite Margaret's insistence the meal was free. Outside, the evening air had cooled. Mason walked to his motorcycle, aware of eyes watching from the diner windows. He reached for his helmet, securing it carefully before straddling the bike. He hadn't expected a parade for helping Lily. He hadn't expected anything at all. The joy of seeing her reunited with her mother was enough. More than enough. It had eased something inside him that had been broken for a very long time. Mason settled onto the worn leather seat of his motorcycle, the familiar contours molding to his body like an old friend. The engine growled to life, with a low rumble that vibrated through his chest. This sound had always brought him comfort, a reminder that he could leave any place, any judgment, any memory behind. The parking lot of the Maple Leaf Diner was bathed in golden evening light. Long shadows stretched across the cracked asphalt, and the neon open sign flickered in the window. Mason took a deep breath of the cool air, tasting the subtle sweetness of nearby cornfields, mixed with the lingering scent of the diner's apple pie. He adjusted his mirrors, catching glimpses of curious faces still watching from the windows. Some were pressed close to the glass, unashamed in their observation. Others hung back in booths, pretending not to look. Mason had grown accustomed to being a spectacle over the years. The iron lantern patch on his back often made him an outsider wherever he went. But something felt different this time, as he prepared to leave Willow Creek behind. The town had seen something in him today that most places never bothered to notice. For a brief moment, they'd looked past the leather and the beard to the man underneath. Well, most of them had, anyway. Mason checked his watch. It was getting late, and he had a long ride ahead. The main highway was still 30 minutes away, and he preferred to do most of his traveling before dark. His headlight caught the edge of a discarded candy wrapper skittering across the pavement, carried by a gentle breeze that rustled through the nearby oak trees. He thought about Lily, her small hand in his, the trust in her eyes, the way she'd called him her hero. Children saw people differently. They didn't carry the same judgments adults did. They just knew kindness when they felt it. Behind him, the diner door opened with a jingle of bells. Mason didn't turn around. It was probably just another customer leaving, or perhaps Margaret coming to offer one last word of thanks before he rode away. He revved the engine lightly, preparing to pull out onto the main street. The sound of rapid footsteps caught his attention. Small footsteps, moving quickly across the parking lot. "Wait! Mr. Bikerman, wait!" Mason's heart lurched at the familiar voice. He turned just as Lily broke free from the diner's entrance, her small legs pumping furiously as she raced across the pavement. Her mother Claire stood in the doorway, looking startled, but making no move to stop her daughter. Mason quickly cut the engine and planted his boots firmly on the ground to stabilize the motorcycle. Lily was running straight for him with the reckless abandon that only children possess. "Lily, be careful," he started to say, but she was already there. With the unrestrained enthusiasm of a 5-year-old, Lily threw her small arms around Mason's leg, pressing her face against the rough denim of his jeans. The force of her embrace nearly knocked him off balance, but he steadied himself, looking down at the top of her blonde head in surprise. "You can't go yet," she declared, her voice muffled against his leg. "You didn't get your present." Mason blinked, unsure how to respond. Through the diner windows, he could see several patrons watching the scene unfold. Even the skeptical rancher had stood up to get a better view. "My present?" Mason asked gently. Lily released her grip and stepped back, digging into the pocket of her dress. Her little face scrunched with concentration as she retrieved something small and carefully folded. "I made this for you," she said proudly, holding up what appeared to be a paper napkin. "It's you and your motorcycle. See?" Mason took the napkin carefully, unfolding it to reveal a child's drawing done in crayon. Crude but unmistakable, the picture showed a stick figure with a bushy beard sitting atop what could only be a motorcycle. But what caught Mason's breath were the wings, large, colorful wings extending from the back of the motorcycle rider. "Those are angel wings," Lily explained seriously, pointing at the drawing. "Because Mommy says angels help people who are lost, and you helped me when I was lost." She looked up at him with absolute certainty. "So you must be my angel." Mason swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. He carefully refolded the napkin and tucked it into the inner pocket of his vest, right over his heart. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I'll keep it safe." Lily beamed, clearly satisfied with his response. Then, without warning, she threw her arms around his leg again in one final hug. The diner door jingled again as Claire stepped outside into the golden evening light. She paused on the threshold, one hand pressed against her heart as she watched her daughter clinging to Mason's leg. The sight of Lily's small arms wrapped around the biker's denim-clad leg created such a striking contrast: innocence and roughness, trust and strength. Claire wasn't alone. Margaret followed close behind, her weathered face softening with a knowing smile. The elderly waitress had seen decades of life unfold in Willow Creek, but this moment seemed to touch even her seasoned heart. "Would you look at that?" Margaret whispered, just loud enough for those gathering behind her to hear. The sheriff stepped out next, removing his hat respectfully as he watched the scene unfold. One by one, curious patrons emerged from the diner, forming a small semicircle around the parking lot. They stood in respectful silence, witnessing the unlikely bond between the intimidating biker and the small child who had captured his heart. Claire walked slowly across the parking lot, her footsteps crunching on the loose gravel. When she reached Mason and Lily, she placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "we should let Mr. Carter get on his way. It's getting late." Lily reluctantly released her grip on Mason's leg, but didn't step away. Instead, she looked up at her mother with pleading eyes. "Can't he come home with us? Just for dinner?" Lily asked. "I want to show him my books and my teddy bear collection." Mason cleared his throat, clearly touched but uncomfortable with the attention from the growing audience. "I've got a long ride ahead, kiddo," he said gently. "Maybe another time." Claire met Mason's eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. The shared understanding of what might have happened if he hadn't stopped on that lonely road. "We can never thank you enough," Claire said, her voice thick with emotion. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and fabric. I made this while we were waiting. It's not much, but I wanted you to have something to remember today." She held out a small hand-sewn patch, roughly the size of a playing card. The edges were slightly uneven, but the stitching was careful and deliberate. Mason took it, turning it over in his calloused hands. The words, "Guardian Angel, Willow Creek," were embroidered in simple blue thread. On the back, in smaller stitches, "Thank you for protecting what matters most." Mason stared at the patch, completely still. The motorcycle rumbled beneath him, but he made no move to leave. "I always carry sewing supplies," Claire explained, suddenly self-conscious. "Force of habit. I thought maybe you could, I don't know, add it to your vest? Or not, it's silly, It's perfect," Mason interrupted, his voice husky with emotion. "Thank you." Margaret stepped forward, her gray curls catching the evening light. "You know," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "in my 40 years at that diner, I've learned you can't judge a book by its cover. Today reminded me of that." The sheriff nodded in agreement. "What you did today," he said to Mason, "that's what this town is about, looking out for each other." Several townspeople murmured in agreement. Someone started a small round of applause that quickly spread through the gathered crowd. Mason looked up, clearly surprised by the show of appreciation. For a moment, his usual guarded expression fell away, revealing the man beneath the intimidating exterior. From the back of the group, a gruff voice spoke up. "Hold on." The skeptical rancher from the diner pushed his way forward, his weathered face set in determination. The crowd parted to let him through. His worn cowboy boots scuffed against the pavement as he approached Mason's motorcycle. For a tense moment, no one spoke. The rancher adjusted his hat, cleared his throat, and extended his hand toward Mason. "Reckon I owe you an apology," he said plainly. "Judged you wrong." Mason hesitated for just a second before accepting the man's outstretched hand. Their handshake was firm, a silent understanding passing between them. "No harm done," Mason replied quietly. Claire gently took the small patch back from Mason's hands. She turned it over once more, running her finger along the slightly uneven stitches. The parking lot had grown quiet, all eyes watching the tender moment unfolding between the biker and the young mother. "It's not much," Claire said softly, almost apologetically. "When they told me someone had found Lily, I was sitting in the sheriff's office with my little travel sewing kit. I always keep it in my purse." She gave a small, self-conscious laugh. "I couldn't just sit there while they were looking for you both, so my hands just started working." Mason remained silent, his weathered face unreadable beneath his beard. The motorcycle's engine still rumbled beneath him, a low counterpoint to the evening's cricket song. Claire continued, her voice gaining strength. "I didn't know who had found my daughter. I didn't know your name or what you looked like. But I knew whoever had stopped for her deserved something. Something to show our gratitude." Lily tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Can I show him, Mommy? Please?" Claire nodded, handing the patch down to her daughter. Lily took it carefully between her small fingers, standing on tiptoes to reach up toward Mason. "See the blue part?" she asked importantly. "Mommy says that's for the sky, 'cause you came out of nowhere like from heaven." She pointed to another section. "And these stitches are for Willow Creek, 'cause that's where we are." Mason leaned down from his motorcycle to get a better look. His hands that had gripped motorcycle handlebars through storms and sunshine, hands that had once fought in bar brawls years ago, hands that had gently carried a frightened little girl to safety, now cradled the small token with unexpected tenderness. Margaret stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. "That's beautiful work, Claire," she said, "especially done in such a hurry." Claire shook her head. "It's messy, really. I was shaking the whole time." "Sometimes," the sheriff observed, "it's the things made in our most desperate moments that carry the most meaning." Mason still hadn't spoken. He turned the patch over again, reading the words on the back. "Thank you for protecting what matters most." His throat worked visibly as he swallowed. "I have a needle and thread if you want to put it on your vest right now," Claire offered, reaching into her purse. "Or you can take it home and—" "I'll wear it," Mason said suddenly, his voice low and rough. It was the first thing he'd said since receiving the gift. "Right now, if that's all right." Claire's face brightened as she pulled out a small sewing case. She carefully selected a sturdy needle and black thread, then looked up at Mason questioningly. "Where would you like it?" Mason considered his leather vest for a moment. The left side already displayed his Iron Lantern Motorcycle Club patch. Without hesitation, he pointed to the right side, directly over his heart. "Here," he said simply. The rancher who had just shaken Mason's hand chuckled. "That's fitting." Claire stepped closer, her hands steady now as she prepared the needle. Mason remained perfectly still as she carefully positioned the patch on his vest. The crowd watched in respectful silence as she began to sew, the needle flashing in the fading evening light. Lily stood watching, her small face serious with concentration as her mother worked. After a few minutes, Claire tied off the thread and snipped the excess with tiny scissors from her kit. "There," she said, stepping back to admire her work. Mason looked down at the patch now permanently affixed to his vest. "Guardian Angel, Willow Creek." The words were simple, but they seemed to hit him with unexpected force. His fingers traced the stitching, feeling the texture beneath his calloused fingertips. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet in the trees surrounding the diner parking lot. The only sound was the low rumble of the motorcycle's engine. "I'm no angel," Mason finally said, his voice barely audible. "You were to me," Lily piped up, reaching for his hand. "You helped me when I was scared." Mason looked down at the small girl whose life he had changed, and who had, perhaps, changed his in return. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a release of tension held for too long. 3 months had passed since the evening Mason had rescued Lily. The summer heat had given way to the crisp air of early autumn, and the countryside around Willow Creek glowed with red and gold leaves. Mason guided his motorcycle along the familiar winding road that led into town. He hadn't planned to return so soon, but a delivery job had brought him through the area, and something pulled him toward the small town that had changed him in ways he still didn't fully understand. The rumble of his bike announced his arrival before he even turned onto Main Street. The sound was distinct, lower and steadier than most motorcycles, and several townspeople looked up from their morning routines as he passed. Unlike his first visit, no one stared with suspicion. Instead, a few people waved, and an older man loading groceries into his truck actually smiled and nodded in recognition. Mason pulled into the parking lot of the Maple Leaf Diner and cut the engine. For a moment, he sat still, remembering the frightened little girl he'd found on the roadside, the suspicious glances inside the diner, and the unexpected gift that now adorned his vest. He touched the patch over his heart. Guardian Angel, Willow Creek, feeling the raised stitching beneath his fingers. When he pushed open the diner door, the little bell jingled above him. The morning crowd was steady but not packed. A few farmers having coffee, some office workers grabbing breakfast, and Margaret bustling between tables with her coffee pot. "Well, look who's back," Margaret called out, her wrinkled face breaking into a wide smile. She set down her coffee pot and walked over, not hesitating to give Mason a quick hug. "Our guardian angel returns." Mason ducked his head, still uncomfortable with the title. "Just passing through," he said quietly. "Nonsense. You're having breakfast," Margaret declared, leading him to a booth by the window, the same one where he'd sat with Lily 3 months before. "On the house." Before Mason could protest, several other diners had noticed him. The rancher who had initially distrusted him raised his coffee mug in greeting from across the room. The sheriff, having breakfast at the counter, nodded respectfully. "Word travels fast in Willow Creek," Margaret explained, pouring him coffee. "Claire and Lily still live just outside town. Claire got a teaching job at the elementary school." Mason nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. It felt strange to be welcomed, to be known for something good rather than feared for his appearance. He had barely taken his first sip when the bell above the door jingled again. A familiar voice called out, "Is it true? Is Mr. Mason here?" Mason turned to see Lily bursting into the diner, her blonde curls bouncing, Claire following close behind with an apologetic smile. "Sorry," Claire said. "Mrs. Winters from the bakery saw you ride in and called us right away." But Lily wasn't waiting for explanations. She ran straight to Mason's booth, clutching a folded paper in her hand. "I knew you'd come back," she exclaimed, her face glowing with excitement. "I made something for you. I've been carrying it in my backpack every day just in case." Mason set down his coffee cup and made room for Lily to climb into the booth beside him. "You have?" Lily nodded eagerly and unfolded the paper with careful fingers. "I drew it all by myself," she announced proudly, smoothing out the colorful drawing on the table. The picture showed a motorcycle, recognizably Mason's with its distinctive shape, but the writer had something unusual extending from his back. Large, carefully drawn wings spread out behind the figure, colored in with brilliant blues and whites. "That's you," Lily explained, pointing to the rider. "With angel wings, 'cause that's what you are. A guardian angel on a motorcycle." Mason stared at the drawing, something tightening in his chest. The child's simple art captured something he'd never seen in himself before. "Do you like it?" Lily asked, suddenly uncertain. Mason cleared his throat. "It's the best present I've ever gotten," he said honestly. Claire smiled, watching the interaction. "She talks about you all the time. Our motorcycle angel." After breakfast and promising to visit again when he could, Mason prepared to leave. The entire diner watched as Lily gave him one last hug on the sidewalk. He carefully folded her drawing and tucked it inside his leather vest, next to his heart. As Mason rode away down the countryside road once more, the guardian angel, Willow Creek patch, fluttered proudly on his vest. The wind carried the scent of autumn leaves, and the memory of a small town that had taught him something important. That one act of kindness